Hello, and welcome to the podcast, An Intelligent Look at Terrorism. I'm your host, Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada. And I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with me as guests on my podcast two individuals who are currently joining me from the United Kingdom, Aimen and Thomas. And I'll just introduce them both very, very briefly before we start this podcast. So Aimen was, and this I'm not making this up, Aimen was one of Al-Qaeda's most respected bomb makers who had sworn allegiance to Osama bin Laden. And after 4 years of working alongside the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, Aimen began working for MI6, which is the British Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, for 8 years, trying to take down Al-Qaeda from the inside. He's currently a consultant on issues of terrorism, and he's the author of 9 Lives, My Time as MI6's Top Spy Inside Al-Qaeda. My other guest is Thomas, who has also a very interesting background. He was training to be a monk, of all things, on Mount Athos in Greece, when he decided instead to spend several years traveling the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Fluent in Arabic, he lived in Damascus for a year while earning a first-class degree in Arabic and Islamic Studies at CSIS, which is a University of London school, very famous school. Now an author and filmmaker based in London, Thomas co-produced the feature documentary Path of Blood and co-authored the book of the same name. So Aimen and Thomas have come together to host Conflicted, a podcast that combines expert analysis and first-person experience to shine light on the complex relationship between history, religion, and politics in the Middle East. So gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having us.
It really is a pleasure for me to have you here. So let's start with a really easy question. I'm sure it'll take us only a couple minutes to resolve this one. Where do you gentlemen think terrorism is going as of January, end of January 2020? As we record this podcast, we're actually on Brexit Day, the day when the United Kingdom decides to leave the European Union. I'm not sure if that's going to cause more terrorism or less, but just curious what you gentlemen think in terms of, there's been terrorism's awfully a lot in the news. We had, of course, the death of al-Baghdadi back early last year. President Trump said that ISIS has been defeated, therefore we all celebrated. It's funny, when al-Baghdadi was whacked by the Americans, I went right back to when bin Laden was killed in May of 2011. And if you remember the celebrations on the White House lawn by average Americans that the war on terror had finally been finished, a little bit of a premature declaration, I would say. And of course, we had the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC general in Iraq, about almost a month ago now. So just curious what you guys think about the so-called war on terrorism, a term that I personally I dislike. Where do you think we're going with all this?
Well, one thing I think is for sure, the war on terror is not going away. I should say terrorism is not going away.
No, it's never going away. Look, for as long as the original cause, I would say, the foundation of why there is terrorism to begin with, is still with us, I think terrorism will never go away.
Are you speaking about Islamic terrorism specifically, Aimen, or in general?
I would say no, Islamic terrorism. Whether it is Sunni or Shia.
And what is that reason? What is that cause, that initial cause?
It's simple. It is a civil war between those who believe in the nation state, the modern nation state, and those who don't believe in the modern nation state and want to bring it down to create their own Islamic empire, a caliphate.
How funny that you should say that here on Brexit Day, when in Britain, people who oppose the modern nation state and people who love the modern nation state have been fighting their own civil war, although more peacefully than your Muslim brothers for some reason.
For sure, yes, for sure.
I'm glad you made that clarification, Thomas, because I was really referring to Islamist extremism as a particular form of terrorism. There's no question that in 2020, all of our nations are faced with a much larger threat than that. Of course, we have, some call it the rise, I would call it the continued presence of the far right, white nationalism, white supremacism. We've had attacks on synagogues, attacks on mosques. We had apparently an attack foiled in Virginia just recently by the FBI, in which a Canadian actually featured quite prominently. So I do want to limit the conversation to this particular niche in the terrorism world for a few reasons. One, it's the thing that I think I know best, having worked in it as an intelligence analyst for many years, and given both of your backgrounds, it seems to me that it's also the particular form of terrorism that you're best versed in. So if it's not going away, let me ask the $64,000 question. With inflation, it's the 64 million or euro dollar question. Where do you think we're headed with all this? I mean, again, President Trump erroneously stated that ISIS had been defeated, And so what's next? I mean, a lot of reporting in the open media about Islamic State actually being, if not as strong as it was with the caliphate, the fake caliphate was created in 2014, certainly has tens of thousands of people active in Iraq and Syria. There are at least 24 affiliates or wannabes Islamic State around the world on most continents. So where are we going with all this?
In order to gauge where we're going from this point, I think we need to go back to the year 2009. It's a pivotal year because in April of that year, the Iraqi forces, by some competence and by some, coincidence also, were able to kill the two leaders of ISIS at that time, or the Islamic State of Iraq only, it was known at the time. Abu Hamza al-Muhajir and Abu Umar al-Baghdadi. Abu Umar al-Baghdadi was the predecessor of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Both were killed in April of 2010, and by May 2010, it was declared that the ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, is dead. That's it. It's over. What was unknown to many is that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who just assumed the leadership, decided that while many cells were broken and smashed and their military capabilities being limited due to the overwhelming sheer numbers of the Iraqi special forces, the Iraqi army, the Americans, as well as the awakening councils or the ACs, the 80,000 tribal Sunni fighters who rose against Al-Qaeda at that time, or the predecessor of ISI, Al-Qaeda. He decided that it is important that to look at what's left of the group's assets and make these assets work to their advantage. So he found that he still got 120 million US dollars in cash. If you remember this, Thomas, we talked about it before. So 120 million US dollars in cash, it was there. And it was remnants of whatever that was available in the Iraqi Central Bank of 2003. Now, there was some urgency. The denominations, the 2002-2003 denominations of the US $100 bills were going to expire in less than a year or two. And therefore, they will never be accepted in the market anymore. The blue greenish dollar is coming into the market, if you remember. So they needed to launder this money as soon as possible. So he spotted an opportunity. He distributed this money, this cash, among 100 cells across Iraq, ordered them to buy, the following assets: farms, small vehicles, big vehicles, trucks and buses, microbuses, in order to move people around. He ordered them to buy existing businesses, such as restaurants, coffee shops, tailor shops, grocery shops, all of these, money making, but also, a good revenue stream businesses, and asked them that they should buy these assets in Baghdad, in Mosul, in Ramadi, in Fallujah, in Salah ad-Din, in places that are near to the government headquarters, whether they are defense or security or any other departments. And the reason is because they wanted to first launder the money, raise more money, have a logistical network, have an intelligence gathering network, and to the point basically where they used to bug the tables where security officers used to come from the defense ministry, from the interior ministry. They used to come to these cafes and talk about their own work, and as a result they were able to recruit many. I've learned of the existence of this network in late 2010, early 2011, and I passed this on to the UK Foreign Office. But the response was that, well, this could be just a ruse by the ISI at the time to tell their followers that they are still relevant, that they are around. But the assessment of the UK government at the time is that, no, ISIS is finished, that's it, and we are going out of Iraq, goodbye.
I'm glad you raised that, Aimen, because we consistently commit this error where we assume that because we've taken out a leader, like when Zarqawi was killed, of course, we assume, well, this is the end, we can wash our hands of this, it's all over. We do that consistently, and I think I referred to bin Laden's killing in Abbottabad in May of 2011. If you think back to that time, it was seen as this great event, and it was a turning point. in how we look at terrorist groups and terrorist organizations. So you're saying that at the time, the UK, the Foreign Office, the intelligence services were dismissing this information, this intelligence coming in, saying that in fact, no, there was an awful lot of money still being sent around. The organization was certainly just as strong as it ever had been, if not stronger. And of course, 3 years later, al-Baghdadi declares the caliphate, the fake caliphate, and then we have the rise of the so-called Islamic State. So why is it, do you think, that Why are we so short-sighted when it comes to, I have my own theories, but I'm curious what you gentlemen think. Why is it that when we take out what we perceive to be a really important leader, like an al-Baghdadi, like a bin Laden, like a Zarqawi, we conclude immediately that it's all over, that they can't recover, that they can't get back to their former height, that they're no longer a threat? Why do you think is we do that?
Aimen may have a different view. I think it's just politics. I think in general we live in a time, the political culture of which is extremely short-termist, and everyone, our leaders are always looking for, tomorrow's headlines. They're always looking to score a victory, a win. I think there's a sort of there's a lot of fantasists in politics. They want to believe that terrorism is something that can be solved when it can't be solved really like the way they wish to solve it. But they want to believe it because it would make their lives a whole hell of a lot easier. And so I think they delude themselves again and again. It's over, it's gone, but it's not.
I completely agree with Thomas actually on this. I noticed it myself because when I passed the information to the Foreign Office in late 2010, it was the new government in the UK, the David Cameron government.
Oh, okay.
And, basically it's this kind of 4 or 5 year cycles of governments that each government comes in and says, I want to wash my hands of the previous government's mistake, and Iraq was the previous Labour government mistake, and therefore I want to wash my hand of it. So therefore the Foreign Office basically did not want to believe that they are leaving Iraq in a more mess than they found it. And you ask what is the reason? Because basically, don't forget, any jihadist group basically is like a chair. They have four, legs. So the 4 legs are like this. You have ideology, you have leadership, you have the soldiers, and you have the money. Mm-hmm. So, basically what's happening is people keep focusing on trying to counter the ideology, which is a bit, always, naive in most cases. And people try to kill the leadership. But they ignore the 2 other fundamental facts, basically the foot soldiers, and the money. And this is why when people said to me, Baghdadi is dead, yes, but did you find his cash? No. Well, Raqqa and Mosul fallen, yes, but did you find the cash? No, because the cash has been taken somewhere else.
No, I'm glad you made that point, because we certainly think we fall into the same trap that we ascribe far too much influence and power to a given leader. And let's face it, for some terrorist organizations, the elimination of the leader is very, very important, because without that leader, the organization falls apart because of the particular power he has, the influence, and how he runs it. But we certainly have seen with most Islamist extremist groups, they're able to survive the loss of a leader for all the reasons that you cited, the fact that there's always money still around and there's still the true believers who are going to follow almost anyone because the cause is true.
If I may say, that problem has existed from the beginning of the so-called war on terror. My understanding is that the documents taken from the Abbottabad compound where Osama bin Laden spent the last years of his life indicate that he was paying attention to what the network was doing. But nonetheless, people always focused, I think, far too much on Osama bin Laden as if he was some dictatorial character who was planning everything step by step. But my understanding, and Aimen, you would know this, of course, better than me, is that it never really worked like that. Certainly not after 9/11, when the network was smashed by the American invasion of Afghanistan. Everything became much more diffuse. There never really was one leader in that way. There may have been one figurehead. But the organization is a much more organic, power diffused sort of thing. Is that right?
I would like to refer you and the listeners to a verse from the Quran. It is chapter 3, verse 144, which established Islam as Islam and not a Muhammadan faith, in another word, basically. So, which says here, and Muhammad is only a messenger. All other messengers have passed away before him. If then he dies or is slain, will you turn about on your heels? So, in other words, Muhammad is just a messenger. Islam is the message. So, therefore, this verse was always written on the walls of the camps of Al Qaeda and other places. Yes.
Wow, that's fascinating.
To remind people it's the cause, not the leader.
I mean, basically, it served a tactical purpose too, because leaders of terrorist organization know that a cruise missile might come at any moment and snuff them out.
Yeah, many people I tell many people that, being a leader, or a commander in a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Shabab or elsewhere, shortens your life expectancy considerably. This is why they say in Arabic, al-qiyada taklif wa laysa tashrif, which means that leadership is a responsibility, not an honor.
Those are interesting points. And I would also point out that, when bin Laden was, of course, taken out by the Americans and Aimen al-Zawahiri, gained the head of Al-Qaeda. I mean, Aimen al-Zawahiri is no bin Laden. He's not the charismatic figure that bin Laden was. In fact, he's quite boring in many ways. And yet the organization is still around. They're still thriving in many parts of the world, which kind of leads to my next question for the two of you. It's all been ISIS all the time, especially since 2014, since the announcement of the fake caliphate. And then, of course, we have the defeat of ISIS, if we believe Donald Trump. Where are we now in terms of, is there a real rivalry between the two groups? Do they get along? I mean, at one point, bin Laden did chastise ISIS for some of its brutality. And so where are we now as of early 2020 in terms of the relative strengths or the relative, I don't want to use the term rivalry necessarily, but sort of the competition, if you will, between these two major Islamist extremist groups in gathering people's attention and carrying out attacks and becoming the top dog when it comes to our target on the types of terrorist groups we want to eliminate?
Before Aimen gives a very detailed response, I'll say, in my view, the best thing that ever happened to Al-Qaeda was ISIS.
Absolutely.
Because ISIS, not only did it take the spotlight off of Al-Qaeda, but it also sort of raised or lowered the level to which terrorism had sunk. So Al-Qaeda could, in comparison, seem to be not so bad. I mean, to locals, not to Westerners, to Middle Easterners themselves. Not only and from the sidelines for a while, Al-Qaeda could learn from ISIS's mistakes. I think, is that right, Aimen?
Yes, and I also want to add that the rivalry between the two, is also steeped in theology. It's steeped in the differences between the two regarding the excommunication of Muslims and the application of Sharia. Who is a Muslim and who's not. As far as the ISIS is concerned, the circle of Islam is so narrow, so defined by the allegiance to its leader, which is they are what I call basically the ideological descendants of the Khawarij.
The Kharijites. The Kharijites, they're known in English.
Yeah, they are the first ever breakaway or splinter group in Islam, even before the Shia. And Imam Ali, fought against them, of course, basically.
If ISIS are the Kharijites, what are Al-Qaeda?
I would say Al-Qaeda actually is what gave birth to these people. So they are the early, what we call zealots. They are because they are the ones who rebelled against Uthman, let's put it this way, and then gave birth after that to the Khawarij. So they are the rebellious, and I would say basically those who opposed, the political order of the early Islamic era. So this is why I always used to say that the problem is many people think that, ISIS is a separate entity from Al-Qaeda. No, ISIS was born out of the womb of Al-Qaeda.
Exactly.
Because, they were the ones who gave birth to this monster.
Well, and you raised an interesting point. Of course, the terrorists themselves, the way that ISIS and Al-Qaeda present themselves, they are the true believers. Everyone else is Khawarij. So for our listeners who don't, know a lot about Islamic history, this is a group of individuals, as you said, in the very early days of Islam, in the early 8th century, or rather 7th century, decided that they didn't like the direction of the faith, and they want to take it in a different direction. And I also liked your point, Thomas, about how Al-Qaeda definitely saw ISIS as, my God, look how bad those guys are. We're not nearly that bad. I would also submit that bin Laden probably had a little party when Bush issued his axis of evil speech and named the Iranians and the Iraqis and the North Koreans the problem. and then decided to invade Iraq in 2003, which of course took the foot off the gas pedal in terms of the pursuit of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if these two groups are sort of, they're both out there, and they're various affiliates. So you look at what's happening, just to take one example, what's happening in places like the Sahel in Western Africa. We've got Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, we've got Islamic State affiliated groups in most countries. So that doesn't seem like that's going to change anytime soon. So what is it that, in your opinion, what is it that we're doing well? And what is it we're not doing so well when it comes to this, again, a terrible term, war on terrorism, but in our counterterrorism efforts, and I'm using counterterrorism efforts as broadly speaking as possible. It's not just military. To me, the military is the pointy end of the stick. There's a lot more that has to happen in counterterrorism. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And how should we change our approach to deal with this phenomenon?
I think we're doing very little right and have done very little right from the beginning. I think Aimen's analysis is spot on that the real struggle is between people who, despite their flaws, support the nation states of the Middle East, and people who, in a more utopian way, wish to create a transnational imperial order dominated by a hardline Islamic sort of law. And so what we have been doing wrong is not intelligently supporting the nation states of the Middle East to strengthen them so that they can deal with this problem in their midst. I think the Trump administration, which I don't particularly support, but I think that its more hardline attitude towards Iran is part of the solution for the whole phenomenon of Islamic terrorism, whether Sunni or Shia, because Iran, because the sectarian nature of Islamic violence at the moment, Islamist violence, is energized by the Iranian government and the IRGC and the Quds Force and all these things to a huge degree, which causes recruitment to rise with the Sunnis. It also, weapons and money flow out from Iran to the whole region, goes into all sorts of players. So the current move against Iran, I think, is part of the solution. But in general, I'm not very hopeful, and I don't think that we've been waging the war on terror intelligently.
No. Yeah, go ahead.
No, so I was going to say to Thomas's point, I think you're right. And, I've argued for years now that seeing this primarily as a military problem is part of the problem. And I agree with you, Thomas, that if we were our best case scenario is to, as you say, equip the states in the region in terms of improving their system of governance, maybe improving their military in terms of how to do counterterrorism, but we're basically carrying the ball for them. And everyone knows that when you send your troops abroad to stay there, to occupy, to even invade, and you're there for decades in the case of Afghanistan, that never ends well for a couple of reasons. First of all, you piss off the locals because they don't want you there. Secondly, you end up killing a lot of civilians that, are not part of the problem. And thirdly, at some point you're going to leave. And if when you leave a vacuum, you haven't provided the locals with enough training and resources to do the job on their own, you go back to the status quo ante in terms of levels of violence. So I would agree with you, Thomas, that if we're going to do something better in terms of this particular approach, we really have to do a much better job at getting the locals to essentially run their own shows in a way that not only counters terrorism, but provides the societies for their own people so that they don't engender more opposition to what they're doing. There's, get rid of, to lessen corruption and lessen inequality and that, which are some of the causes why people join terrorist groups in the first place. So I think it's a really good point you made. Sorry, go ahead, Aimen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always used to say is that if we diagnose the illness properly, which is the fact that it is a civil war within Islam that is sucking in the West for all the obvious reasons, but if it is a civil war between the modern nation state as a concept and as an institution, and which is fighting against three distinct factions that want to bring it down in order to create their vision of a transnational empire based on religious ideals. So, for example, the three factions are as follows. You have the Sunni political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. You have Sunni militant Islam, the jihadists like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Shabab, Hamas. And then you have finally the political and militant Shia Islam represented in Wilayat al-Faqih system in Tahan. So the Iranian regime, basically, because many people say that the Iranian regime, is a nation state. I say, no, there are two Irans. There is Iran, the nation state, and then there is Iran, the revolution. which was headed actually by Ayatollah Khamenei and Qasem Soleimani. So we have to deal with these three threats, which sometimes they cooperate together, sometimes they fight each other, but they have only one defined enemy, which is the modern nation state and the pride of the people in their modern nation states. The problem is there are many nation states in the region that are failing their own people, and as a result, they are weak. And there are other nation states that are strong and, basically perfected to some extent the social contract between them and their people. Look at, for example, a country like Oman. Even though basically it's not entirely Sunni, but they are Sunni in a sense, like they follow basically a certain, strand of Sunnism, but 40% are conventional Sunnis there. Yet, Oman, a country of 2 million, how many people from Oman joined ISIS? And the answer is none.
None, yeah.
How many joined Al-Qaeda? One, and he had mental issues. Basically, look at the UAE, for example. You have 1.5 million Emiratis. How many of them joined ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Syria? 12. That's it. And in their entire history, 12. And the numbers basically are, look at, for example, Indonesia, basically, which suffered from terrorism and Islamic extremism. And yet, you would expect basically there would be thousands of Indonesians, given there are 220 million Muslims in Indonesia, you would expect thousands would have joined ISIS. And the answer basically is that the maximum number is 300. So what happened in Indonesia, and Oman and other places that really reduced the numbers, while in a place like Tunisia, you have thousands, basically more joining? And the answer is, good governance and economic growth.
I'm really glad you raised the point of Oman. I had a chance to go there a couple of years ago and was suitably impressed with the Omani state. And of course, we now have the transition from Qaboos to the new leadership. But I think it's a really good point that you make, is that Oman, it's a small country. It's kind of out of the way and no one really pays attention to it. But it is a success story insofar as that, as you said, it hasn't led to a lot of its citizens joining terrorist groups, whether they're indigenous or outside. Now, Oman is faced with some economic pressures going forward. But I think it does serve, if not, maybe the role model is the wrong word, but certainly something's working very well in Oman. And if we can learn something from that, maybe that's what we need to go forward.
Although, Oman is also an extremely deeply rooted state. It has a long tradition of statecraft, that country. So, that's not something that can be just reproduced in a newish state, that the region is full of.
Although the UAE and Kuwait, basically these countries, even though they are new, they managed somehow. And why? Because there is a more equitable distribution, basically of natural resource wealth. This economic contract, the social economic contract between the governing classes and the people, to some extent succeeded in making sure that the people basically do not fall prey, in large to, basically to groups like ISIS or Qaeda.
Plus the monarchical principle, don't forget. Monarchies tend to inspire allegiance better than these tin pot Republican presidents.
And even democracies in the region here, democracies failed because there is no culture of democracy. There is no foundation. Look at Lebanon, look at Iraq.
Well, those are really good points. So as I predicted at the beginning of this podcast, we've barely scratched the surface in terms of this particular issue. I really appreciate the points you've made. I'd like to ask one last question before we sign off. So this has been a rather depressing podcast. Not that it's either of your gentlemen's fault, but it's the nature of the beast sort of thing. Do you see any shining silver linings? Is there anything on the horizon you see that actually is working well for us and something we might want to do more of? I'm just trying to, I am an optimist by nature, and I'm a Canadian, so I'm somehow, middle of the political spectrum. Can we end possibly on a positive note, or is that asking too much?
Well, I'll say, and of course, this can only be tentative. I would say, I mentioned before the new move against Iran. I think that's positive. I think the extent to which that foreign policy shift against Iran by the Americans is bringing the Sunni world together in a very positive way to face that threat together, and includes, in fact, Israel as well, which I tentatively think that's a good development. If the whole region can come together and realize that the Iranian revolution is really the heart and soul of this problem, or at least the heart, if not the soul of the problem. That's good. I also think that in general, the reforms that are taking place within Saudi Arabia are encouraging and could only, as long as they succeed and the country does become more economically prosperous and liberal and society is less reactionary, that can only lead to improvements in ideological terms.
Well, I mean, if you see what happened in the months and the year, in the months before March 2015, when the Saudis launched their war against the Houthis in Yemen, the number of Saudi recruits who used to go to ISIS was roughly about 90 per month. After the Saudi intervention in Yemen to counter Iran's growing influence there, dropped to only 20 per month. So suddenly you can see that there is a quantifiable evidence that sectarianism in the region was a driver in the recruitment of people like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because they presented themselves as the only defenders of the Sunnis against the growing tide of Shia militancy. So that's why in May, just 2 months after that, in May of 2015, Baghdadi issued one of his rarest audio tapes in which he attacked the Saudi regime 28 times. Because why? Because he believed that their war on Yemen was hurting his cause, that the Saudis took again the leadership in countering Iran's influence militarily and took this bold decision to do it.
So is there any other silver linings for you apart from the ones I talked about?
Well, there is a new movement growing now within the Muslim world, especially within the Sunni discourse of the Middle East, examining many of the hadith texts in order to see whether they are authentic or not, because they were, focusing a lot on prophecies that were used by jihadists to recruit and to base strategy on. So, this is one of the things I hope that will produce enough material, not to convince jihadists, but enough to confuse them.
I think that's a good point, Aimen. And again, just for my listeners who aren't familiar with the Hadith, these are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which are seen very much as complementary to the actual Quran itself. And as you state, terrorist groups regularly use both Quranic verses and Hadith to justify why they think that Allah wants them to use violence in His name to achieve the societies they want. So, well, gentlemen, I think that was mildly positive. It's probably more than I could expect from you both at this juncture. I think it's important as well to point out that, while terrorism still is a phenomenon that we will be dealing with for the foreseeable future, it's equally important not to overblow its influence and the threat level. So, obviously in places like Afghanistan, with the Americans signed a so-called peace treaty with the Taliban, which I don't support personally, that country is faced with an existential threat if the Taliban gains influence. But the rest of us in the rest of the world, we have to get away from this notion that terrorism poses an existential threat to any of us. So I think that...
Of course, I'm glad you say that. I wish people would say that more. That's the worst part of the war on terror, is it convinced Westerners that they were threatened by Islamic terrorists, when that was never true.
Exactly. I mean, we've all had attacks and plots and things like that, and that's been bad, and people have died, and I'm not trying to dismiss that. But again, as I say to people, taking my own country, Canada, for example, we've been a country for a little more than 150 years, and in 150 years, we've had, at most, 20 deaths from all forms of terrorism. 20 deaths is a bad morning, or maybe a good morning in Afghanistan. So I think it's really important to point out that from our perspectives as Westerners, that yes, it's important that we have our security services, and yes, there's a role for the military, and yes, there's a role for civil society in identifying people going down this pathway to try to get them to leave it. And that, what you said, Aimen, re-examining the hadiths to try to say that, no, this is not what it means. This is not what the Prophet Muhammad meant when he said this 1400 years ago. But at the same time, terrorism is almost like a rounding error or a statistical blip when it comes to the problems that we face in society. So I want to thank the two of you for joining me on this podcast, and I definitely want to invite you back in the future to re-explore these issues. So thank you for taking the time, and I wish you both well.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, guys. Goodbye.